Have you ever looked at Europe and wondered why, despite all its diversity and drama, it seems to steer clear of the extreme political and economic swings you see elsewhere? Why does it always seem to gravitate back towards the middle ground? It's a fascinating question, and the answer isn't found in today's headlines, but deep in the continent's scarred past. The story of modern Europe is a story of survival, a story written in the ruins of devastating wars and ideologies gone mad. This isn't just history, it's the very DNA of European policy today. Let's rewind to the first half of the 20th century. Imagine a continent tearing itself apart. Twice, the Great War or World War I was a meat grinder that consumed a generation. It was a war of empires, of nationalism cranked up to a fever pitch. The result? 10 million dead soldiers, countless civilians, and a map of Europe redrawn in bitterness and resentment. Economies were shattered, societies were broken, and a deep sense of disillusionment set in. People were desperate for answers, for someone to blame, for a new path, and that desperation created a vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped the extremists. In Russia, the Bolsheviks seized power, promising a workers' paradise but delivering a brutal totalitarian state. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists marched on Rome, championing aggressive nationalism. And most catastrophically, in Germany, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, rose from the ashes of economic collapse and national humiliation. They offered simple, terrifying solutions to complex problems, scapegoating minorities and promising a return to a mythical glorious past. These weren't fringe movements, they captured the hearts and minds of millions. The result was World War II, a conflict that dwarfed the first in its scale of destruction and horror. It wasn't just a war between nations, it was a war of ideologies, a struggle against the most extreme forms of fascism and Nazism. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, stands as the ultimate testament to where unchecked extremism can lead. By 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, economies were non-existent, and the continent was grappling with a moral and psychological collapse. It was from this absolute low point, this year zero, that the modern European project was born. The survivors, leaders like Konrad Adenauer in Germany, Robert Schuman in France, and Alcide de Gasperi in Italy, looked at the devastation and came to a simple, profound conclusion: never again. They understood that the twin poisons of extreme nationalism and radical ideology had nearly destroyed them all. The only way to prevent a third, and likely final, world war was to build a new kind of Europe, one based on cooperation instead of conflict, on compromise instead of confrontation. This never-again philosophy became the bedrock of everything that followed. The first step was economic. The European Coal and Steel Community, founded in 1951, pulled the very resources needed to wage war: coal and steel under a common authority. It was a genius move. By intertwining the economies of former enemies like France and Germany, it made future conflict not just unthinkable, but materially impossible. This was the seed that grew into the European Economic Community and, eventually, the European Union we know today. The entire project was an antidote to economic nationalism, the idea that one country's gain must be another's loss. But the fear of extremism wasn't just about preventing war. It also profoundly shaped Europe's domestic policies. After the war, a broad consensus emerged across Western Europe, a political model that we now call the social democratic consensus or the social market economy. This wasn't pure socialism, and it certainly wasn't pure laissez-faire capitalism. It was a compromise, a deliberate attempt to find a middle way. Think about it. On one hand, you have the memory of the Great Depression, when unregulated capitalism led to mass unemployment and social unrest, creating fertile ground for fascism. On the other hand, you have the looming threat of Soviet communism right on their doorstep, an ideology that crushed individual freedom in the name of the collective. The European solution was to take the dynamism of the market, but temper it with a strong social safety net. This is why European countries, to varying degrees, have robust welfare states, universal healthcare, public education, generous unemployment benefits, and strong worker protections. These aren't just policies. They're seen as essential pillars of social stability. They are the buffer against the kind of desperation that can lead people to embrace extreme solutions. The idea is that if people have a basic level of security, if they feel that society has their back, they are far less likely to be seduced by the siren song of demagogues who promise to burn it all down. It's a preventative measure, a societal immune system built from the lessons of the past. This aversion to extremes also explains the structure of many European political systems. Many countries use forms of proportional representation, which tends to produce coalition governments rather than the winner-take-all systems seen in places like the United States or the United Kingdom. While this can sometimes lead to messy and slow decision-making, its primary purpose is to foster consensus and force parties to work together. It deliberately moderates politics, pulling parties towards the center to form a government. It is a system designed to prevent a radical fringe party from gaining absolute power with just a slim majority of the vote. It prioritizes stability and compromise over decisive, but potentially divisive, one-party rule. Even in moments of crisis, you can see this institutional muscle memory kick in. Look at the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Eurozone debt crisis. The pressure was immense. Countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal faced economic collapse. The temptation towards radical, go-it-alone solutions was strong. There were calls to abandon the euro, to default on debts, to tear up the rulebook, and yet, what happened? After years of painful, difficult negotiations, the core of the European project held. The response was a classic European compromise, a mix of austerity measures demanded by more fiscally conservative northern countries and financial rescue packages and new support mechanisms to help the struggling southern economies. It was messy, it was unpopular, and it was far from perfect, but it avoided the extremes. It avoided the complete collapse of the single currency, which would have been an economic catastrophe, and it avoided a simple, no-strings-attached bailout, which was politically impossible. It was a long, painful muddle through the middle. Why? Because the alternative, letting the system shatter, was a step back towards the fragmentation and rivalry that never again was meant to prevent. Today, this historical programming is being tested like never before. We see the rise of new populist and nationalist movements across the continent. These parties often echo the rhetoric of the past, blaming immigrants for social problems, railing against the elites in Brussels, and promising to take back control. They are tapping into genuine anxieties about globalization, cultural change, and economic insecurity. And yet, even with this surge, Europe's allergy to the extreme holds surprisingly firm. When these parties get close to power, or even enter government, a few things tend to happen. First, the mainstream parties often form broad cordon sanitaire coalitions to keep them out of the highest offices, as we've seen in Germany and France. Second, when populist parties do enter government, the realities of governing within the complex EU framework often force them to moderate their most radical positions. The institutional architecture of Europe, the laws, the treaties, the shared economic interests acts as a powerful gravitational pull towards the center. It's a constant battle. The trauma of the 20th century is fading from living memory. For younger generations, never again is a history lesson, not a personal experience. The very success of the European project, decades of peace and prosperity, can lead to complacency. People forget what the alternative looks like. But the next time you see European leaders engaging in another marathon summit, arguing for days over seemingly small details, remember the ghost in the room. They are not just debating fishing quotas or budget rules. They are subconsciously, and sometimes consciously, working to maintain the delicate balance that has kept the continent from falling back into the abyss. They are the inheritors of the project born from the ashes, a project whose core mission is to manage disagreement, to foster compromise, and to steer the continent away from the seductive and ultimately destructive call of the extreme. Europe's fear of its own past is, in many ways, its greatest strength and its best hope for the future. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the European mindset interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. We'd love to have you with us. See you next time.